Hi there guys, today I'm going to be talking to you about modelling. This is my presentation as part of a task from the University of Sussex to research a particular area of pedagogy and to present my findings on how it is applied in the classroom today. So, the key facts as to what modelling is and where it comes from, the principles underlying it. When I first started looking into this, the real thing that struck me was actually there was little in the way of concrete research or any great variety of literature on modelling itself. But what it can be traced back to is a man by the name of Albert Bandura. Now, Bandura was a very famous cognitive psychologist working out of America and was very famous for this infamous Bobo experiment, which I'll talk about in a second. But it links into this idea. He was very famous for the social learning theory. He provides this quote here where it says, "Fortunately, most human behaviour is learned observationally through modelling. From observing others, one forms an idea of how new behaviours are performed, and on later occasions, this coded information serves as a guide for action." And that was in 1977 that he said that. What that overall links to is the idea that from observing others, from watching others perform actions or perform behaviours, perform tasks, children particularly learn to imitate that behaviour and those tasks as a result of seeing it demonstrated. This most famously occurred when Bandura performed the Bobo doll experiment, but beyond that and merely into looking into the replication of aggressive behaviour, he looked into this wider idea of observational learning, particularly in this book, The Social Learning Theory, in 1977. This observational learning idea relates to a set of principles to guide how children learn through watching modelled behaviours or examples. It's linking that overall idea that actually lots of our behaviours and actions don't come from any sort of innate impulse or genetic makeup. It comes from actually just replicating what we see performed in front of us. And by emphasising social dynamics in that sense, Bandura's work can be connected to Lev Vygotsky's ideas of social learning and social development, particularly in the classroom. That quite nicely links into modern practice, where observational learning is prominent in emphasis on teacher modelling. This is seen quite prominently in Barak Rosenstein's Principles of Instruction, which is obviously very in vogue at the moment in teaching. His fourth principle actually says to provide models, and providing students with models and worked examples can help them learn to solve problems faster. Now, when it comes to the key features of what modelling, what observational learning might look like, there are two tiers to this. When it comes to observational learning itself, Bandura and Jeffrey in 1973 described 4 processes that account for learning from observation. The first is perhaps the most to the point, which is you need to be paying attention. Attention is critical to making sure the child is fully on task and making sure they're observing the behaviours that will be performed later on. The second being retention, the ability to store information to make sure that can be recalled upon later and they're saving that into their long-term memory. The third being reproduction, so either through rehearsal or just sheer practice, making sure those observed behaviours are being reproduced over and over again, so it becomes a habit, it becomes learned. And then finally, motivation is key as well, to appreciate incentives or reinforcements to make sure that the task is completed fully. How that transposes into teacher modelling in the classroom today is in a variety of ways, predominantly because modelling can come in a variety of forms. As I've said on the slide here, it can range from demonstrating performance, so whether that's a teacher demonstrating a correct maths equation, or a science experiment before pupils do them themselves. Metacognitive models, so whether you're explaining your thinking as you go through a problem to make sure that students understand the underlying principles, the thought processes in a task. If it's a scaffolding technique, if you're simply modelling a way for this student to complete the task fully in their own ability, or even just to a student-centred approach, so whether you have a student themselves model for the rest of the class, either through some previously high standard work or demonstrating something like perhaps in PE, doing some keepy-ups or something like that. What's particularly helpful for us is that Chaucer School in Sheffield have suggested a common preparation process throughout all of those steps, and these 5 steps here. The first one is to prepare in advance, make sure that you literally know what you're going to be going through, you've got everything prepared, whether that's you've written an example paragraph before your English lesson, or you've set through the equipment you're going to need for your science lesson. The second one is account for prior knowledge. So you might be thinking about, okay, how am I going to explain this in a way that links into what the students are familiar with? Am I making sure I'm tying into a section of the book they've read already, for instance? The third is to always model your thinking. That's the metacognition I've talked about already. But to think out loud the connections and reasons for developing the model. A nice way of thinking about this one is if you're writing out an analytical paragraph, say in English or might be in history even, you think about if you're going to what we call live model that, you talk about how you might say, oh, I've actually made a mistake there. And talk out loud how you're going through your thinking. Why do you understand that might be wrong? Why do you understand that might be right? Are you making sure you're making those connections really explicit when you're going through them in your mind? The fourth step, which I may or may not be demonstrating very well at this point, is to keep teacher modelling short and sweet. It's the idea that you don't just spend a lesson showing students exactly how to do something perfectly and taking up the entire hour or whatever amount of time you spend teaching. Make sure it involves itself in a wider learning sequence so that they have the idea, as we go into step number 5, to allow them time to practice it themselves. The model will only be beneficial if it provides a step to greater and further learning.